The role of colonial women in economic development. When we think of colonial history, we often picture governors, soldiers, merchants, and powerful men whose names were recorded in official documents. But hidden behind these grand narratives is another story, a quieter, often overlooked story, of women whose hands and labor helped build the very foundations of colonial economies. These women were not passive observers of history. They were farmers, traders, artisans, and household managers. They tilled the land, crafted essential goods, managed homes, and even engaged in trade across villages and towns. Their role was not secondary, it was central, woven into the very fabric of economic life. To truly understand their contribution, we must step back into the socio-economic reality of those times. Picture a colonial settlement, fields stretching across the horizon, markets buzzing with activity, and communities struggling to survive in the face of uncertainty. In this world, women's work sustained families and fueled local economies. In agriculture, they planted and harvested crops, ensuring food security. In craftsmanship, they produced textiles, pottery, and household goods that were vital for daily living. In trade, many women became entrepreneurs, exchanging goods in bustling markets, quietly shaping the financial lifelines of their communities. But their role was far more than just economic, it was generational. The resilience and resourcefulness of these women laid the groundwork for future stability. By supporting family structures and strengthening community networks, they influenced the development of labor markets and local economies in ways that history often forgets to acknowledge. Consider this: while colonial men were often tied to military service, governance, or long-distance trade, it was women who kept the local economies alive. Their daily efforts ensured continuity in times of disruption. Without them, the fragile balance of colonial life would have collapsed. And yet, their contributions were often pushed to the margins of historical records. Historians today are revisiting these stories, recognizing that economic development during colonial times cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the indispensable role of women. So, when we talk about the economic history of colonial societies, let us not only remember the governors, generals, and traders. Let us also honor the women, those whose unseen labor, creativity, and determination shaped economies, sustained families, and left behind a legacy that still resonates in modern societies. Their story is not just history, it is a powerful reminder that true economic development has always depended on the resilience and contributions of both men and women, working side by side, even if one half of that story has long remained in the shadows. Picture life in the early colonial world. Families building new lives on unfamiliar soil, communities struggling against harsh climates, and societies taking shape under the influence of both old traditions and new realities. In the midst of all this stood women, each navigating her role within a complex web of expectations, opportunities, and challenges. The socio-economic background of colonial women was far from uniform. Geography, class, ethnicity, and religion all played decisive roles in shaping their lives. In New England, the Chesapeake, and the Middle Colonies, women were expected to be versatile, caretakers at home, contributors in the field, and active participants in their communities. These expectations were a blend of European traditions carried across the Atlantic and the unforgiving demands of life in the New World. Colonial America was, by and large, a patriarchal society. Male authority dominated households and communities. Yet, economic necessity gave women a certain measure of influence. The agrarian economy, where survival hinged on hard work, meant that women's labor was not optional, but essential. They cooked and cleaned, yes, but they also sowed seeds, harvested crops, spun textiles, and, in many cases, even took part in local trade. Their hands kept families alive, their work fueled the prosperity of entire communities. But not all women shared the same realities. Wealthier women, especially in the southern colonies, lived very different lives. With resources at their disposal, they could delegate household labor to servants or enslaved people. Their role was often centered around managing households, hosting social events, and maintaining the status of their families in elite circles. For poorer women, life was far more demanding. They not only cared for their homes but also worked tirelessly outside them, cultivating crops, raising livestock, selling goods in bustling local markets. These women blurred the line between domestic and public life. Their survival depended on it, and through their labor, they became pillars of economic activity in their communities. So, when we talk about the socioeconomic background of colonial women, we're not just speaking about social roles or expectations. We're uncovering the foundation of colonial life itself, one where women's resilience, adaptability, and determination made the difference between hardship and survival. Their stories remind us that economic history is never just about structures and systems, it is also about people, and the everyday lives of women who held their societies together in the face of constant challenges. When we picture colonial society, it's easy to imagine men as the central figures: farmers, merchants, politicians, and soldiers. But beneath that surface lies another, often overlooked truth: women were the backbone of colonial life. Their roles were not static or simple, they were multifaceted, shifting and adapting to the immediate needs of their families and communities. Yes, women were wives and mothers, but they were far more than that. In reality, they were managers, producers, laborers, and entrepreneurs. The colonial household wasn't just a place to live, it was a unit of production. And at the heart of it all, keeping it running, were women. Inside the home, women oversaw the household economy. They budgeted scarce resources, prepared food, raised children, and cared for the elderly. This labor, often invisible in history books, was vital. It sustained families and, in turn, stabilized entire communities. But their responsibilities didn't stop at the doorstep. In the fields, women planted and harvested crops, ensuring food security. And when husbands were absent, whether due to trade, war, or other duties, many women stepped up to manage entire farms on their own. Their skills extended far beyond agriculture. Women were artisans, producing textiles, pottery, candles, and countless other household goods. These creations weren't just for personal use, they became part of local trade, weaving women directly into the economic networks of the colonies. In this way, domestic life and economic life weren't separate worlds, they overlapped, and women stood at the center of both. In towns and cities, women expanded their roles even further. They worked in shops, as seamstresses, midwives, and in various trades, contributing to the growing colonial economy in urban spaces. Yet, not all women had the same experiences. For enslaved women, life was marked by unimaginable hardship. Forced to labor in homes and fields under oppressive conditions, they were exploited as both workers and caretakers. And yet, even in this harsh reality, enslaved women showed resilience. They built networks of support and community, carving out small spaces of dignity and agency in a world designed to deny them both. Taken together, the roles of colonial women were not secondary, they were essential. They sustained families, supported economies, and shaped the very fabric of colonial society. Their contributions were not just about survival, they laid the foundations of practices, structures, and traditions that would influence generations to come. So, when we tell the story of colonial times, we must look beyond the names of governors, generals, and merchants. We must also tell the story of women, the silent architects of stability, resilience, and growth in a world that often refused to recognize their power. When we think of the colonial era, we often imagine ships docking at harbors, merchants trading goods, and men toiling in the fields. But beneath that surface lies a deeper truth: women were the silent engines driving the economy forward. Their work was not just supportive, it was foundational. During this period, women played vital roles in shaping the economy, weaving themselves into every sector essential for the survival and growth of colonial societies. And yet, their contributions were often ignored, their stories left untold. Today, however, modern scholarship is finally shining a light on their resilience, their skill, and their impact. From agriculture and food production to crafts, textiles, and trade, women stood at the very heart of economic life. Let's begin with the backbone of colonial society: agriculture and food production. Farming was more than a livelihood, it was survival itself. Women were deeply involved in every stage of the process. They managed farms, sowed seeds, harvested crops, and preserved food that kept families alive through harsh winters. In many households, women were the guardians of the garden, cultivating herbs and vegetables that not only fed their families but also supplied local markets. In rural areas, women worked shoulder to shoulder with men in the fields. They tended livestock, rotated crops, and even understood the subtle science of soil management and pest control, knowledge that kept farms productive. Take the example of tobacco in the southern colonies, a cash crop that fueled entire economies. Behind its success were countless women whose labor ensured that households could thrive and communities could prosper. But their contributions didn't stop in the fields. Women mastered food preservation, canning, drying, pickling methods that ensured food security all year long. These techniques didn't just provide stability at home, they created surplus goods that could be sold or traded. In bustling colonial markets, women's stalls were filled with baked bread, fresh dairy, and preserved foods, products that became lifelines for local economies. So, when we speak of colonial development, we must remember this: women were not just helpers, they were economic builders. Their hands shaped not only the meals on the table but the prosperity of entire communities. Now, let's step away from the fields and farms and enter another world, a world filled with colors, textures, and creativity. This was the world of crafts and textiles, where colonial women left an indelible mark on both their families and their communities. Inside humble homes, you could hear the rhythmic hum of spinning wheels and the gentle beat of weaving looms. Women, skilled in their craft, transformed raw wool, flax, and cotton into thread, cloth, and garments. These weren't just clothes, they were symbols of survival, identity, and even pride. Each stitch carried a story, each fabric bound families together, and each creation strengthened the economy. But their influence went beyond the household. Many women ran small-scale textile businesses, producing garments and cloth goods that were sold in local markets. Imagine the craft of quilting, for example, where groups of women gathered in circles, sharing patterns, teaching techniques, and creating quilts that were both useful and beautifully decorative. These gatherings weren't only about sewing, they were about building friendships, sharing knowledge, and contributing to the economic pulse of their towns. And textiles were only one piece of the picture. Women's hands also shaped pottery, molded candles, and crafted soap items that were essential for daily life. These products found their way into bustling markets and lively fairs, where women artisans became traders, linking households to the wider economy. In truth, the craftsmanship of colonial women was more than simple handiwork. It was innovation, resilience, and enterprise rolled into one. Their artistry not only sustained families but also laid the groundwork for local economic development. They were creators, entrepreneurs, and community builders, proving once again that the colonial economy could never have thrived without their contributions. When we think of trade and commerce in the colonial world, images of merchants, ships, and bustling markets often come to mind. But hidden in this story is another truth, one that is too often forgotten. Women were not silent observers of commerce, they were active participants, shaping the very networks that kept colonial economies alive. In local markets, women could be seen selling homemade goods, freshly baked bread, dairy products, and preserved foods. They bartered herbs, medicines, and crafted items, sustaining their families while strengthening the lifeline of their communities. Their stalls and baskets were more than sources of income, they were anchors of survival and social connection. But some women went even further. When husbands were away, or occupied elsewhere, women often stepped into leadership, managing family businesses. They ran taverns, inns, and general stores, places that were the beating heart of local commerce. Take the example of Mary Johnson, a woman in Colonial Virginia, who successfully managed her own tavern. Her story reveals how women turned necessity into opportunity, stepping into roles that history often reserves for men. Their influence stretched beyond the marketplace. Women became intermediaries, connecting producers to customers, and local goods to broader markets. They used their social networks not just for friendship, but for business, expanding opportunities, negotiating prices, and building relationships with suppliers and buyers. And though their names may not always appear in the ledgers of international trade, their work was deeply woven into it. The textiles they spun, the crafts they created, the food they preserved all became part of a larger economic system that fed into transatlantic trade. Their invisible labor helped sustain the framework of colonial expansion. So, when we speak of the economic history of the colonies, we must not overlook this truth: women were central architects of trade and commerce. Their hands, their minds, and their resilience shaped not only family economies but also the broader colonial economy. Without them, the story of early America would remain incomplete. When we turn the pages of history and step into the world of colonial societies, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the impact of women on economic development was both profound and multifaceted. These women were not confined to household duties alone. Their influence stretched far beyond the walls of their homes, reaching into the fields of agriculture, the world of crafts, the bustling centers of trade, and even into the very structure of labor markets. They were farmers, artisans, traders, and silent architects of economic systems that would go on to shape generations. To truly understand their impact, we must look deeper into the various dimensions of their economic roles. We must see how their hands sowed the seeds that fed families and markets, how their skills produced goods that fueled commerce, and how their resilience supported not just their own households but entire communities. Their contributions were not temporary acts of survival. They left behind a legacy, a lasting economic framework woven with threads of labor, creativity, and determination. Colonial women shaped the fabric of early societies in ways that history often overlooked, but which modern understanding now brings to light. So, when we speak of economic foundations in the colonial era, we are not just telling the story of markets and trade, we are telling the story of women whose silent strength became the heartbeat of early development. When we look back at colonial societies, one thing becomes very clear: the family unit was not just a home, it was the very foundation of the economy. And at the heart of this foundation stood women. They weren't simply caretakers confined to the domestic sphere. They were economic strategists, managers, and producers who played a decisive role in keeping families, and by extension, entire communities afloat. Picture this: a colonial household where every resource mattered. Women took charge of food preparation and preservation, ensuring survival during harsh winters. Their kitchen gardens brimmed with vegetables and herbs, while small-scale animal husbandry provided meat, milk, and wool. These weren't just domestic chores, they were acts of economic resilience. But their influence stretched even further. Women often became the financial managers of their households. They budgeted, allocated resources, and made decisions that directly shaped the family's financial stability. In a world where survival was uncertain, their choices meant the difference between scarcity and security. And then came production. Women spun wool, wove linen, and stitched clothing, not just to clothe their families, but to strengthen the family's wealth. In fact, their skills in textiles and crafts often generated income, proving vital during times of hardship. But they didn't stop at production for their homes. Many women stepped into the marketplace, selling candles, soap, baked goods, and other homemade products. These goods were bartered, traded, and sold, becoming threads in the fabric of the local economy. Through their craft and commerce, women created networks of trade that extended beyond their homes and into the community. In essence, colonial women were not silent figures in the background. They were architects of family economies, weaving together survival, stability, and prosperity. Their efforts laid the groundwork for more complex economic systems, leaving a legacy that shaped the very structure of colonial life. When we talk about the labor markets of the colonial era, one truth shines through: women were not bystanders, they were architects of change. As women stepped into fields, workshops, and marketplaces, they began to reshape the very structure of colonial labor. Their hands, their skills, and their persistence created ripples that would redefine what work meant in those societies. Take agriculture, for example. In many colonies, subsistence farming was the backbone of survival. Women worked shoulder to shoulder with men, planting seeds, harvesting crops, and processing food. Their labor wasn't secondary, it was essential. Without their contribution, families and entire communities would have struggled to maintain food security. This direct involvement in agriculture added new depth to the labor market, fueling its growth as colonial economies expanded. But their influence didn't stop in the fields. In crafts and textiles, women carved out their own economic niche. They became skilled artisans, spinning, weaving, sewing, and producing the very goods that sustained everyday life. Clothes, tools, household items all bore the mark of women's craftsmanship. By doing so, they stepped into spaces once reserved for men, subtly but powerfully challenging labor norms and broadening the definition of work. And then came trade. As women entered marketplaces, selling goods from candles to clothing, they sparked something larger, a ripple effect. Their ventures inspired and enabled other women to step into commerce, creating webs of traders and artisans. These networks were more than just economic systems, they were communities of resilience and solidarity, where women shared resources, supported each other, and thrived together. In shaping labor markets, colonial women did more than provide for their families. They forged new paths, redefined roles, and laid the groundwork for an economy that could not ignore their presence. Their story is not just one of survival, but of transformation, an enduring reminder that women's labor has always been a force of progress. When we look back at the colonial era, one truth becomes clear: the legacy of women in economic development is not just history, it is a living force that continues to echo in our world today. These women were not confined to the walls of their homes. Their resilience, their determination, and their creativity laid the foundations upon which future generations of women would stand. Through their efforts, they carved out space in economies that were often hostile to them, and in doing so, they prepared the ground for the rights and opportunities women pursue today. One of the most powerful, long-term effects of their contributions was a shift in perception. For centuries, women had been seen as secondary, as passive participants in society. But when colonial women proved their ability to farm, trade, craft, and manage resources, they shattered old ideas of gender roles. Bit by bit, they challenged the notion that economic life belonged only to men. This transformation was not just social, it was revolutionary. It opened doors to education, to employment, and to the fight for equality. Their work also brought something else into focus: the immense value of women's labor. Too often their efforts were dismissed or invisible, yet without them colonial economies would have crumbled. They brought knowledge, skill, and ingenuity, ingredients that fueled growth and prosperity. And even though they were rarely recognized in their time, today their contributions remind us of the urgent need to value women's labor fairly, to build policies that empower them, and to ensure true gender equity in the workforce. But their legacy is more than economic. These women built communities and networks, circles of collaboration, support, and solidarity. These networks survived long after the colonial period, evolving into women's organizations and advocacy movements that fought for justice across centuries. The same spirit that bound women together in colonial marketplaces and homes still drives modern movements for women's rights and economic justice today. And here's the larger lesson: history is incomplete if we only tell the stories of kings, governors, and generals. The true richness of history lies in acknowledging voices that were once silenced. The story of colonial women is not just a footnote, it is a central chapter in understanding how societies were built, how economies thrived, and how resilience shaped the future. So, in conclusion, the impact of colonial women cannot be overstated. They sustained family economies, reshaped labor markets, and left behind a legacy that endures to this day. Their stories are not merely historical accounts, they are timeless narratives of strength, ingenuity, and courage. And when we tell their stories, we don't just honor the past, we inspire the present and the future.